Hi. I created a database that includes 5 tables. I probably shouldn't have included that many tables because it got a little bit complex and a little confusing at some points, but I did 5 tables and I named it Diabetes Registry. Right here, all the tables here. And I'm opening up showing my diagram, and I did a table that included patient demographics, glucose monitoring test results, glucose monitoring test types, patient diagnoses, and diagnoses types. Um, the patient demographics, it can have many relationships with the glucose monitoring tests and diagnosis types. So there can be many, each patient can have more than one test type, and each patient can have more than one diagnoses. So, so I show the relationship here that from the patient demographics, there, the main link is the patient ID with the glucose monitoring test results, and then the relationship with the test types is the test ID, and the relationship with the patient demographics with the patient diagnosis is the patient ID, and then the diagnosis ID is the relationship with the diagnosis types. Um, and each table, the unique identifier, I put as the patient ID for the patient demographics, and oh, sorry, and the unique identifier for the patient diagnosis, I did the diagnosis ID, and for the glucose test types, sorry, glucose test types, the description would be the unique identifier, and then for the diagnosis types, the diagnosis description would be the unique identifier. Um, yes. So then I'll open the table, and here, well, I don't need to open the table to show that. For the patient ID, I use integer because it'll include numbers as well. For the names, I just use varchar, and the street address I use varchar. Um, the city varchar, but zip code I use integer, and the provider ID I use integer, and for the date of birth I use date time. Here for test results, for test ID, I use integer, and test results I use integer as well because the results will only have numbers. For the date, I use date time, and the glucose timing is varchar. And for patient diagnosis, I use integer. Integer is used for everything because it's the patient ID and the diagnosis ID, um, and the year. For the I only used year because for the diagnosis, most of the time the doctors just want to know um, how long you've had diabetes or anything like that. So I think the year is the most important thing. But of course, if it was an actual database, I would put the full month and day. And for glucose monitoring test types, I used test ID for integer, and varchar for the test description, and then integer for diagnosis ID, and varchar for diagnosis description. Okay, so I'll open up and I'll show the everything I entered. And yes, and I also, chose the primary key for patient ID. The primary keys for everything um, is usually always the first one. So patient ID, primary key. And for these, the middle tables, the glucose monitoring test results, and the patient diagnosis, the primary key, it has two primary keys, the patient ID and the test ID, and then the patient ID and the diagnosis ID, because they're also primary keys in these two tables here. Okay, so now I'll open, and here I entered all the 20 names and addresses that I made up. It was interesting making up everything. And that's for all the patient demographics. Um, yeah, the name, address, the gender. I just, put the females first and males second. Gender, and then the provider ID. And then the glucose monitoring I entered here. Well, I'll open this first, the glucose monitoring test types. I just used two test types. I used the plasma glucose and the hemoglobin A1C. I just used two test types because it would have gotten very complex if I used more than two, or if I used five, because each patient would have a test result, so it would become a very huge database. So I only use two test types. Yeah, plasma glucose and A1C. And then here it has the patient ID only, the test ID, and then the test results. So this is the plasma glucose results, and this is the A1C results here. Glucose and A1C. And then I put in the date when it was run, and then the glucose timing is when, if they did a fasting before the blood was taken, or if it was just a random test. So here shows if it was random or if it was on fasting, which is very important to know. Okay, now here for the diagnosis, I used type 1, type 2, pre-diabetes, diabetic retinopathy, which can eventually happen to the eyes if the blood sugars aren't controlled, and hypertension, which unfortunately some people have both. So now here, the patient diagnosis, then I have the patient ID and then the diagnosis ID. And as you can see, some patients are here more than once. Like, some patients are here more than once because they have more than one diagnosis. And then I put the year of when it was diagnosed. And, most patients are here just once, but some are here even 3 times. This one's here 3 times. And yeah, so that's that table. And this one also, the test, each patient has the A1C and the glucose test. So each patient is here twice as well. Okay, so that's my database. Hopefully, I did well. I'll also include a copy of it when I send it to you. Thank you.